The pines sang a low, mournful song in the winter dark. Out here, the wind had a voice, and tonight it was screaming. Smoke clawed its way out of the crooked chimney of my cabin, the only proof of life for 100 miles. Inside, I sat by the fire, just me and the silence. For 10 years, that silence had been my only companion. It didn't ask questions. It didn't judge. It just was. The days were all the same. Split logs, tend the horse, watch the sun bleed out behind the mountains. I hadn't spoken a word in so long. My own voice felt like a stranger. Solitude had whittled me down to the bone, and in that hollow place, I'd found a kind of peace. Or so I thought. Tonight was different. The wind wasn't just blowing. It was tearing at the cabin walls, throwing snow around like angry ghosts. The fire suddenly snapped, a gunshot in the quiet, and it jolted me. Then came a sound that had no business being there. A knock. Soft, but certain. On my door. My heart, which usually beat slow and steady like a drum in a funeral march, went wild. It hammered against my ribs, a frantic prisoner trying to escape. 10 years. 10 years since another human hand had touched that door. My hand trembled as I reached for the rifle propped against the wall. Habit. Old habits die hard. I rose slowly, my joints groaning in protest. Each step across the floorboards was a lifetime. I reached the door, the cold seeping through the wood, and pulled the heavy iron latch. The storm roared in, and with it, 3 figures. They were framed in the doorway, like a picture from a book I'd never read. An old man, his hair in 2 long silver braids, broad shoulders wrapped in a heavy buffalo hide. He stood like an ancient mountain, immovable. Beside him, 2 girls. Young, but their eyes held the hardness of lifetimes. Their cloaks were heavy with snow, their faces raw from the wind's bite. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. Their stillness screamed with an urgency that hit me right in the gut. They needed shelter. The night was a killer, and they were in its path. My tongue was a lead weight in my mouth, but my body moved before my brain could argue. I stepped aside, opening the door wider, and ushered them into the warmth. The firelight danced across their faces, painting them in shades of orange and red. Snow melted from their cloaks, hissing as it hit the hot stones of the hearth. The old man's eyes were sharp, missing nothing. He was measuring me, weighing me. I could feel it. The daughters moved with a quiet grace. One stayed close to her father, a shadow clinging to a rock. But the other, the elder, her eyes roamed the small cabin. They snagged on the rifle, then on the simple iron pot hanging over the coals. I saw a flicker of something in her gaze. Not fear. Something else. Recognition? I stirred the stew, the smell of rabbit and wild herbs filling the small space. I ladled it into 3 tin bowls and set them on the small table. My hands, usually so steady, had a slight tremor. The younger daughter offered a small, hesitant smile as she took her bowl, but the elder one, she kept her eyes down, her focus locked on the swirling steam. It was like the weight of the storm, the weight of the whole world, was sitting right on her shoulders. We ate in silence. The only sound was the scrape of spoons against tin, soft and rhythmic like a slow heartbeat. The old man watched my every move. He saw me shift my own worn blanket from my cot, saw me drape it gently over the shoulders of his elder daughter without a word. He saw the respect in the gesture, a thing given freely, asking nothing in return. His expression didn't change, but I felt something shift in the air between us. The daughters began to whisper to each other in a language I didn't know. Their voices were soft, tired, but laced with a current of relief. The storm raged outside, clawing at the shutters like a trapped animal, but inside, a fragile calm was settling. I took out a needle and thread and began mending a tear in one of my old saddlebags. My fingers, rough and calloused from years of hard labor, moved with a surprising patience. At one point, I pricked my finger with the needle. A single drop of dark blood welled up. I swore under my breath, a word I hadn't used in years. The younger daughter, who had been watching me, let out a tiny, stifled laugh. It was a small sound, but in the crushing silence of my life, it sounded like a symphony. It filled the entire cabin, chasing the shadows into the corners. Even the old man's eyes softened for a second, a barely perceptible crack in his stony mask. He had seen it. He had seen the first chip in the wall between us. Sleep came for them slowly. The daughters curled up on the pallet I'd laid out for them, their breaths rising and falling in time with the fire's glow. The old man didn't sleep. He leaned against the far wall, his eyes closed, but his posture alert. A guardian. I took my usual spot, my back to the door, my old hat pulled low, the rifle resting across my lap. It wasn't about mistrusting them. It was about mistrusting the world. It was a habit born from 1,000 lonely, dangerous nights. But tonight, for the first time, the loneliness felt different. It was less empty. When dawn finally broke, it was pale and cold. The storm had passed, leaving the valley wrapped in a blanket of pristine, silent snow. The world looked clean, new. The daughters stirred as their father was already on his feet, gathering their few belongings. They moved with the same quiet efficiency as the night before. As they prepared to leave, their glances kept finding me, full of unspoken questions. I opened the door to a world that glittered. The air was so cold it burned my lungs. I offered no words to make them stay. I just gave a single, stiff nod. But the old man paused on the threshold. He turned back, and his gaze held mine for a long moment. It wasn't a look of suspicion anymore. It was a look of acknowledgement. A silent understanding had passed between us in the night. He had seen the man behind the silence. He had seen the care given without condition, the respect that demanded nothing. And though he still said nothing, the silence between us was no longer a void. It was full. It held the weight of a debt, a promise, the promise of paths crossing again. I watched them walk away, 3 dark figures against the blinding white snow, until they were swallowed by the pines. I stood in the doorway for a long time, the cold seeping into my bones, my breath pluming in the air like smoke. And for the first time in a decade, the silence that settled back into the cabin didn't feel like my own. It was haunted by their presence, by the echo of a little girl's laugh. I stepped back inside, the fire nothing but glowing embers. I knew, as surely as I knew my own name, that the knock on my door wasn't an ending. It was the beginning. The weeks after the storm were a blur of white and gray. I fell back into my old rhythm, but something was off. The cabin felt too big, the silence too loud. I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see them emerge from the woods. At night, I'd swear I could still hear the ghost of their whispers over the crackle of the fire. The hollowness inside me was back, but now it had a name. It was loneliness. I just hadn't recognized it before. Then, one afternoon, when the last of the winter snow was finally melting, I heard it again. Not a knock this time, but the sound of hoofbeats, steady, purposeful. I stepped outside, my hand instinctively going to the pistol at my hip. It was them, the chief and his 2 daughters, riding on sturdy ponies. They weren't fleeing a storm this time. They were here for a reason. The elder daughter's eyes met mine for a split second before darting away. But that one look was enough. It held a new awareness, a tension that hadn't been there before. The younger one grinned, a bright, uncomplicated flash of warmth. The chief dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. His gaze was still watchful, but the hard edge of suspicion was gone, replaced by something I couldn't quite read. Consideration. That was the first of many visits. They became a new rhythm in my life. Sometimes they'd stay for a night, sometimes for a week. They never explained why they came, and I never asked. We didn't need words for that. I knew they came because this small, lonely cabin had become a sanctuary, a place where the world couldn't touch them. Around the fire, stories started to unfold, piece by piece. The chief, whose name was Blackhawk, spoke of his people, of their struggles, of the land that was being stolen from them. He spoke of treaties broken as easily as twigs. I listened. I didn't offer opinions or solutions. I just listened. And in that listening, he found a kind of respect he rarely got from my kind. The daughters, Anaba and Nita, grew more comfortable. Nita, the younger one, was a whirlwind of curiosity. She followed me on my chores, asking endless questions, her laughter echoing off the canyon walls. But Anaba, the elder, remained a mystery. Her silence was deeper than mine. It was a fortress. She moved with a quiet competence, helping around the cabin without ever being asked. There was a strength in her stillness that drew me in, a resilience like a river stone, smoothed by 1,000 storms, but never broken. One evening, as the sun set the sky on fire, Anaba and I walked down to the stream to fetch water. The silence between us was comfortable, a shared language. The path was slick with moss, and her foot slipped. I reached out and caught her arm, my hand closing around her wrist. My fingers were rough against her smooth skin. For a long moment we just stood there. Her dark eyes searched mine, and for the first time she didn't look away. There was no surprise in her gaze, no fear. There was only recognition. A silent, powerful understanding passed between us. It wasn't a flash of lightning. It was the slow, steady warmth of an ember taking hold. But peace like that is fragile, and the outside world always finds a way in. One day, a trapper named Jebediah stopped by my cabin. He was a greasy, foul-smelling man with eyes like a rat. He'd passed through the valley once or twice before, but this time was different. His gaze lingered on Black Hawk and his daughters, a sneer twisting his lips. He sat by my fire, uninvited, and spoke in a low, venomous voice. He talked about old grudges between settlers and the Apache. He talked about blood spilled. His words were poison, meant to remind me of the wall that stood between our worlds. I listened in a cold silence, my jaw tight. I saw Anaba's face harden, her hands clench into fists. She knew men like Jebediah. They were everywhere. When he finally rode off, leaving a cloud of unease hanging in the air, I went back to chopping wood. I didn't say a word, but my silence was a promise. No man's hatred was going to poison this place, but Jebediah's visit was more than just a passing ugliness. It was a warning shot, and it was aimed right at my heart. Because that night, as we all sat around the fire, I knew what I had to do. I stood up and faced Black Hawk. My voice, rusty from disuse, was rough, but it didn't waver. I asked for his permission to marry Anaba. The words dropped into the silence like stones into a deep well. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. Blackhawk stared at me, his face a mask of stone, completely unreadable. Nita's eyes were wide with shock. Anaba sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, but I could see the rapid rise and fall of her chest. She wasn't breathing. The chief's silence stretched on until the very air in the cabin felt thick and heavy, like we were all drowning in it. I kept my shoulders straight, my gaze locked on his, even as my heart tried to beat its way out of my chest. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low and heavy, filled with the sorrow of 100 generations. He told me about the betrayals his people had suffered. He spoke of white men with honeyed words and hearts full of lies. He told me he had sworn an oath to his dying wife that he would never let his daughters marry an outsider, never subject them to that kind of pain and risk. His words were not angry. They were filled with a profound, bone-deep sadness. I didn't argue. I didn't make promises I couldn't keep. I just lowered my head in acknowledgement of his pain. Then I lifted my gaze again, and I let him see it all. The 10 years of loneliness, the hollowness that Anaba's presence had started to fill. I let him see that I wasn't asking for her as a conquest, or out of pity. I was asking because I had found in his daughter a strength that mirrored my own, a silence that spoke the same language as mine. And I wanted to honor that for the rest of my days. The chief's gaze shifted from me to his daughter. "What does your heart say, Anaba?" he asked softly in his own tongue. She didn't hesitate. She rose from her seat and walked to my side. She reached out and placed her small, warm hand over my own rough, calloused one. Her touch was a brand. She looked at her father, her eyes steady and clear, filled with a quiet defiance and an unshakable certainty. In that single, simple gesture, everything changed. The fire seemed to roar to life, pushing back the shadows. Black Hawk's shoulders slumped, and a long, slow breath escaped his lips. He saw it. He saw that this was not a whim, not a fleeting fancy. It was fate. He could no more stop it than he could stop the turning of the seasons. Slowly, his head bowed in a single solemn nod. "My heart is heavy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I see the truth. I give you my blessing." My hand tightened over Anaba's, not in triumph, but in reverence. Outside, the stars blazed in the clear, cold sky. The silence that filled the cabin now was not one of emptiness or tension. It was the silence of a vow, a promise made without words, but more binding than any treaty. 2 lonely, silent lives, now bound together by a thread stronger than steel, a thread strong enough to face whatever storms were coming. And I had a gut feeling that the real storm hadn't even started yet. Our life together began as it had been lived before, in silence. But it was a different kind of quiet now. It was a shared space, not an empty one. We learned each other's rhythms. The way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear when she was deep in thought. The way I'd pause at the woodpile and watch the sun catch the silver in her father's hair. We built a life with our hands, not our words. I added a room onto the cabin. Black Hawk taught me how to read the signs in the earth, the language of the birds. Nita's laughter was the soundtrack to our days, but that peace was a thin sheet of ice over a dark, churning river. And the ice was starting to crack. One morning, I found a dead hawk on my doorstep. An arrow, fletched with dirty gray feathers, was buried deep in its chest. It wasn't one of Black Hawk's arrows. This was a message, a threat. Black Hawk saw it, and his face turned to granite. "Jebediah," he whispered, his voice a low growl. "He is a scout for a man named Cain, a man who brings only death." The name hit me like a physical blow. Cain. A ghost from a life I had buried so deep I'd almost convinced myself it was just a nightmare. I kept my face impassive, but inside, a cold dread began to spread through my veins. It couldn't be. Not him. Not here. "This Cain," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "What do you know of him?" Black Hawk's eyes were dark with memory. "He leads a band of cutthroats, vultures. They came to our village years ago, seeking a map to what they call the Valley of Gold. They burned our homes. They took our people." His voice broke, and he looked towards Anaba. It was the day the laughter was stolen from my daughter's voice. My blood ran cold. The raid, the fire, the screaming. It all came rushing back. I was there. I was part of it. Before I was this silent man in the mountains, I was someone else. Someone terrible. And Cain was my brother. I didn't tell them. I couldn't. How could I tell this family, this woman I loved, that the monster who haunted their past was my own flesh and blood? That his sins were my sins? So I stayed silent. A different kind of silence this time, a silence built on a lie. The signs got worse. A string of my traps were sprung, the animals stolen. A strange carving appeared on a tree at the edge of my land. A snake eating its own tail. Cain's mark. He was closing in. He was hunting. But was he hunting Black Hawk, or was he hunting me? I started sleeping with my rifle in my hand again. I taught Anaba how to shoot. She was a natural. Her hands were steady, her eye was true. She never asked why, she just learned. She could feel the darkness gathering at our doorstep. One night, Nita came to me while I was cleaning my guns. "Silas," she said, using the name I had given them, a name as false as the peace I'd built. "You are afraid." It wasn't a question. "We have to be careful," I said, my voice flat. "It is more than that," she insisted, her young eyes sharp and knowing. "You know this man, Kane. You know his mark." I froze. My lie was a house of cards, and this little girl was about to blow it all down. I couldn't look at her. I just kept cleaning my pistol, my knuckles white. The next day, it happened. We were outside, mending a fence, when the sound of a dozen horses thundered through the valley. They weren't trying to be quiet, they were announcing themselves. A war party. I shoved Anaba and Nita towards the cabin. "Get inside! Bar the door!" Black Hawk grabbed his own rifle, his face grim. "They have found us!" They crested the ridge, a group of hard, ugly men led by a figure who sat on his horse like a king on a throne of corpses. Even from a distance I could see the familiar swagger, the cruel set of his jaw, and the long, jagged scar that ran down the side of his face. The scar I had given him the last time I saw him. It was Kane, my brother, and he was smiling, a smile that promised nothing but pain. "Brother!" he called out, his voice echoing across the valley, a sound that ripped open all my old wounds. "Did you really think you could hide from me?" I saw Anaba's face through the cabin window. Her eyes were wide with a terror so profound it stole the air from my lungs. She wasn't just seeing a bandit. She was seeing the man from her nightmares, the man who had silenced her. Black Hawk looked from Kane to me, his eyes filled with a dawning, horrified understanding. He finally saw the truth. The monster at his door and the man he had welcomed into his family were connected. They were two sides of the same cursed coin. "Silas," Black Hawk whispered, my false name sounding like a curse on his tongue. "What have you done?" The siege began. Bullets tore through the air, splintering the wood of the cabin. They had us pinned down. We were outnumbered, outgunned. Kane was patient. He knew he had us trapped. He shouted taunts, his voice dripping with venom, revealing pieces of our shared, bloody past for my new family to hear. He talked about the banks we'd robbed, the men we'd killed. He painted a picture of me that was so monstrous I hardly recognized it myself. But it was true. It was all true. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with smoke and fear. Nita was crying softly in a corner. Black Hawk was firing methodically through a crack in the wall, his face a grim mask of betrayal. He wouldn't even look at me. But Anaba was somewhere else. The gunfire, the shouting, Kane's voice. It had thrown her back into the horror of that day. She was huddled by the hearth, rocking back and forth, her eyes vacant. Then her hands started to move. With a shaking finger, she began to draw in the ash and soot on the hearthstones. At first, it was just lines, frantic and meaningless. But then a face began to take shape. A face with a cruel smile and a jagged scar. Kane's face. Then she drew another figure next to him. A younger man, his face clean, his eyes just as hard. It was me. Me from 10 years ago. And in my hand, I was holding a torch. Black Hawk saw the drawing. He looked at me, his eyes burning with a righteous fury. "You were there," he choked out. "You helped him burn my home. You helped him destroy my daughter." "It's not that simple," I tried to say, my voice cracking. "Isn't it?" he spat. "You are one of them." The accusation hung in the air, heavier than the gunfire. And in that moment, I knew I couldn't hide anymore. The lies had to end, even if it meant losing everything. During a lull in the shooting, while Kane's men reloaded, I told them everything. My real name was Caleb. Cain was my older brother. We were raised by a brutal father who taught us that the only way to survive was to take what you wanted. We ran away and formed a gang. For a while it was about survival. But Cain grew to love the cruelty, the power. The raid on Black Hawk's village was the last straw for me. Cain wasn't just looking for a map, he was enjoying the terror he caused. I saw him strike down a woman. I saw him back a young girl into a corner, a terrible look in his eyes. That girl was Annaba. Something inside me snapped. I turned on him. We fought, brother against brother, amidst the flames of the burning village. I cut his face with my knife, and he shot me in the side. I fell, and he left me for dead. I managed to crawl away, and I ran. I ran until I couldn't run anymore. I found this valley, and I buried Caleb deep in the ground. I became Silas, a man of silence, hoping to starve the monster inside me. When I was done, the cabin was utterly still. Black Hawk stared at me, his expression unreadable. Nita had stopped crying and was looking at me with a strange mix of fear and pity. Then Annaba moved. She crawled over to me. She looked at the drawing of me with the torch. Then she looked at my face. Her hand came up, and with her finger, she wiped the torch from the hand of the man in the drawing. Then, she drew something else in its place. A bucket of water. She remembered. She remembered me fighting the fire, trying to save people. She remembered me turning on my own brother to protect her. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. And then she did something that shook the foundations of my world. She opened her mouth and a sound came out, a raw, hoarse whisper. "You saved me." Her voice. I had never heard her voice. Black Hawk's hardened face crumpled. The hatred in his eyes was replaced by a wave of confusion, and then a flicker of understanding. I hadn't been Cain's accomplice. I had been his first victim. Just then, Cain's voice boomed from outside. "Time's up, brother. I'm coming in. I want my map." The map. In all the chaos, I had forgotten. "Black Hawk," I said, my voice urgent. "The map. He can't have it." "The map is a lie," Black Hawk said, his voice low. "There is no valley of gold. The map leads to a sacred place, a hidden valley with springs that can heal the sick. It is our last hope. If he finds it, he will defile it, destroy it, just for spite." Suddenly, everything clicked into place. This wasn't just about my past anymore. It was about their future, and I would not let my brother destroy another innocent life. "I have a plan," I said, my voice hard with a resolve I hadn't felt in 10 years. "But it's going to be dangerous." Annaba looked at me, her dark eyes clear and steady. She picked up the rifle I had taught her to use. She didn't speak again, but her actions spoke louder than any words. She was with me. We were no longer hiding. We were going to fight back. There was a secret exit in the cabin, a tunnel I had dug years ago that came out in a rocky crevice 100 yards away. It was my last-ditch escape plan, a relic from a past where I was always looking over my shoulder. Now, it was going to be our weapon. "Black Hawk, you and Nita go through the tunnel," I instructed, my voice sharp and clear. "Get to high ground. Use your bow. Draw their fire. Annaba, you're with me." Black Hawk hesitated for only a second. He looked at his eldest daughter, at the rifle she held with an unshakable grip, and then at me. The betrayal in his eyes was gone, replaced by a grim alliance. He nodded once, a warrior accepting the terms of battle. He hugged Annaba tightly, whispering something in her ear, before disappearing into the darkness of the tunnel with Nita. The cabin fell silent. It was just me and Annaba waiting. The air was electric. I could feel Cain's impatience growing outside. He thought he had us cornered. He thought we were afraid. He was wrong. "He'll come through the front door," I whispered, my voice barely a breath. "He's arrogant. He'll want to see my face when he wins." Annaba nodded, her eyes fixed on the door. She positioned herself behind a heavy overturned table, the rifle resting on the edge, aimed straight at the entrance. The seconds stretched into eternity. Then, the splintering crash of the door being kicked in. Kane stood there, silhouetted against the daylight, a monster in my doorway. His men fanned out behind him. "Well, well, brother," he sneered, his eyes scanning the seemingly empty room. "Nowhere left to run." That was my cue. I fired, not at Kane, but at the oil lamp hanging from the ceiling beam just above him. It exploded, showering him and his men in burning oil and glass. They screamed, batting at the flames. In that moment of chaos, two things happened at once. From the ridge above, the first of Black Hawk's arrows sang through the air, finding its mark in the throat of one of the gunmen. And from behind the table, Annaba fired. Her shot was perfect, hitting another man square in the chest. The fight was a blur of smoke, fire, and violence. Kane, roaring in fury, was momentarily blinded. I used the confusion to move, a ghost in the shadows of my own home. I was no longer Silas, the quiet homesteader. I was Caleb, the fighter, the survivor. But this time, I wasn't fighting for greed or survival. I was fighting for redemption. Annaba was incredible. She moved with a deadly grace, her silence making her a lethal hunter. She didn't waste a single shot. For every one of Kane's men who tried to enter the cabin, she put them down. She was taking back her power, one bullet at a time. Soon it was just Kane left. His men were dead or had fled. He stood in the middle of the chaos, his clothes singed, his face a mask of pure hatred. His eyes found me. "Just you and me now, little brother," he hissed, raising his pistol. We both fired at the same time. His bullet ripped through my shoulder, a searing hot pain. My bullet hit his gun, sending it flying from his hand. He lunged at me, pulling a long knife from his belt. The fight was close, brutal. He was bigger, stronger, fueled by years of rage. He slashed at me, cutting my arm, my side. I was weakening, my vision starting to blur from the blood loss. He pinned me to the floor, the knife at my throat. "I should have finished the job all those years ago," he snarled, his face inches from mine. I thought it was over. But he had forgotten about Annaba. From the corner of my eye, I saw her move. She had set down the rifle. In her hands was a lariat rope from the corral. With a flick of her wrist, she threw a perfect loop. It sailed through the air and settled around Kane's neck. Before he could react, she pulled it tight, using the ceiling beam as leverage. Kane choked, his eyes bulging. His grip on the knife loosened. It was the opening I needed. I kicked out with all my remaining strength, sending him staggering backward. The rope pulled taut, lifting him off his feet. He clawed at his throat, his face turning a dark purple. His eyes, full of shock and hatred, were locked on Annaba. It was the last thing he ever saw. The silence that followed was absolute. It was over. Annaba rushed to my side, her hands gently probing the wound in my shoulder. Her eyes were filled with concern, with a fierce, protective light. Black Hawk and Nita ran back into the cabin. Nita rushed into her sister's arms, both of them crying, not in sorrow, but in relief. Black Hawk walked over to me. He looked at the devastation of my home, at the body of my brother, and then at me. He placed a hand on my good shoulder. "You have a new name," he said, his voice heavy with meaning. "The people will call you Akacheta, he who fights for us." He had forgiven me. He had accepted me. Not as Silas, the hermit, not as Caleb, the sinner, but as Akacheta, the protector. In the days that followed, we buried the dead and rebuilt the cabin. The silence between me and Annaba was no longer a barrier. It was a bond. She still didn't speak much, but she didn't need to. We communicated with glances, with touches, with a deep understanding that went beyond words. Her laughter, once stolen, slowly began to return, starting as a small smile and growing into a sound that was more beautiful than any song. We had faced the ghosts of our past and won. Our small, strange family, born from a storm and forged in blood and fire, had found a new kind of peace, a peace we had earned. We had found it not in the silence of solitude, but in the quiet strength of standing together. This story is a reminder that the past doesn't have to define you. It's about the choices you make today that shape who you become. It shows that even the deepest wounds can heal, and that sometimes the most profound connections don't need any words at all. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of justice and redemption from the hidden corners of history, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss a single episode.